Welcome to the Resilient Surgeon, part of the STS Surgical Hot Topics podcast. Our goal with the Resilient Surgeon series is to inspire our colleagues to be their best selves in and out of the operating room, using scientifically proven tools and recovery strategies of the world's top performers. I'm Dr. Michael Maddaus, and in each episode, I will talk to game changers who will share evidence-based practices, real-world strategies, and their own personal stories and experiences to help you build your resilience and to help you be your best self no matter what. Our guest today on The Resilient Surgeon is Dr. Huggy Rao, Professor of Organizational Behavior and Human Resources at Stanford, and the topic is friction. Yes, friction. I first became profoundly aware of the importance of friction in our lives when I heard Ed Bastian, the CEO of Delta Airlines, state several years ago, and I quote, "Our goal is to remove as much friction as possible for the customer." And with Delta, you can feel it, or should I say, not feel it, when dealing with them. In general, it is the most frictionless airline I've ever dealt with, and it makes me a loyal, raving fan of Delta. Now, if only hospital administration would adopt the same goal, to remove as much friction for the employees and physicians at their hospitals. Unfortunately, we have a state of affairs that is akin to what David Brooks wrote about in a piece in the New York Times entitled "Death by a Thousand Paper Cuts," where he describes the massive bureaucratization of all of our society, with healthcare administration being one of the largest industries to do so. Yet another training, another set of forms to fill out, another seminar that's required, hundreds of useless emails, and the inane amount of data and EMRs in the fields to fill out. Each one of these administrative assaults is, as Brooks describes, like a small cut. Each one bleeds some, it stings, and if it's the only one, no big deal. But getting cut again and again, day in and day out, leads to constant emotional and energy loss, and frankly, demoralization. It all seems hopeless, as if the administrative paper cuts is a juggernaut that cannot be stopped. But it can be slowed and even brought to a crawl with the right effort. And Dr. Huggy Rao is here to help teach us how to do just that. Huggy has written a book with his Stanford colleague, Richard Sutton, called The Friction Project: How Smart Leaders Make the Right Things Easier and the Wrong Things Harder. In the book, they cover the profoundly negative impact of too much friction, both on individuals and on the organization as a whole, and how leaders and even individuals who have no formal title can do so much to reduce unnecessary friction, and also, on the flip side, where a little friction can be very good. Before I read their marvelous book, I had simply assumed that the friction juggernaut was here to stay and that there was little, if anything, that could be done about it. I was wrong. I hope that you, after listening to Huggy and hopefully reading their book, will find some friction to smooth out in your world. And now I bring you Huggy Rao. Well, our guest today is Huggy Rao, professor at Stanford University and one of the co-authors with Bob Sutton of the book, The Friction Project. Huggy, welcome to the Resilient Surgeon podcast. It's an honor and a great pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so very much, Michael. It's both a delight and a privilege. I'm very much looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you. Well, just a little tidbit about myself. I love Delta Airlines. Okay. I am a Delta sycophant. All right. And why is that? Because Ed Bastian, the CEO of Delta, I remember when I heard him say it on some broadcast, our goal is to remove as much friction as possible for the customer. And the fact is, they've done that. They've made it so it works. And it's incredible. And that's why I am a sycophant for that organization. You know, when I came across the book, The Friction Project, that you and Bob Sutton wrote, at first I didn't know exactly what it meant. I wasn't sure and kind of a little hesitant. But then as soon as I started reading it, I realized what an important and vital topic this is. of course, not just for universities, but for all organizations, because of the damage that can be done to human flourishing by the lack or the excess friction that we have to deal with instead of doing our jobs in the way that we want and care to do them. So my huge thanks to you. And as I want everybody to know, this is an incredible framework for understanding this process and the problem of friction in the workplace. And so just thank you so much for the work you've done. It's magnificent. Yeah.
Thank you. It means a lot, Michael, coming from you. Very much appreciated. Lots of people helped us get to
Of
where the
course.
book is.
Yeah.
So thank
Yeah.
you.
Well, you and Bob wrote another fabulous book, which I cannot recommend highly enough to any leader, and that is Scaling Up Excellence. Okay. And that's a book about scaling up excellence in all corners of their organizations. But it's my understanding, and you correct me if I'm wrong, that after writing the book, you encountered some, I don't know, aha moments or something where something sparked an interest in this idea of friction after that book. And it was kind of a direct result of that book. Can you elaborate on that and what led you to study this
Absolutely.
business?
Absolutely, Michael. And thank you for establishing that link and connection with Scaling Up Excellence. Bob and I had fun writing Scaling Up Excellence, and we were pleased that it was received well. And I think we suspect it was a nice little fluke that made us happy. We became a Wall Street Journal bestseller. We'll take it.
I doubt it was a
You know,
fluke because the book has got some that's I just want to also say the beauty of what you guys are writing here and other authors like yourself in academic institutions, and I really mean this, is you marry the science with an incredibly practical, street-oriented approach,
exactly.
understanding what's going on out in the real world. And I just think it's
Right.
magnificent what you guys have done in that
Thank
regard.
you. And thank you. As I like to say, the secret is in marrying clean models with dirty hands.
Yes, lovely. Well
You
put.
know,
Yeah.
yeah, because the research gives you clean models. I mean, for all the reasons you know too well, but you need dirty hands to get things done. And making the
Mhm.
marriage is like the thing, and which is why it took us 7 years to write Scaling Up Excellence, because we had to teach the material to
Yeah.
MBAs, to executives. Otherwise, it doesn't sing. And the same thing with the
Right.
Friction Project. Anyway, in response to your question, when we wrote the Friction Project, what we quickly realized was people responded very positively to the message. The top and senior echelons of any enterprise loved it. As we went down to the middle and lower rungs of the organization, people appreciated the message, but it was always accompanied by a lament.
And this is a
And the
scaling up
lament,
excellence now. The message
yeah,
is,
the
yes.
scaling up the theme,
Yep. Yeah.
and the lament was, it's hard to get anything done.
Mhm.
And, that kind of stopped us in our tracks. And people think often that you write books because you have ideas, and of course we do. But there are things that others say to you that are simply unforgettable, that are either like a big prod or a punch to the gut.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
one such reaction in a Stanford program, I mean, I'm sitting there and teaching in this executive classroom. Everybody has nameplates except one person. And I said, hey, where do you work? And that guy's response was, Professor, and he said that mischievously, I work in a frustration factory.
So
I was,
that's where that came from. Yeah.
yeah, I was like totally floored. And I'm thinking, like, how could you even summon the energy to go to work every day?
Yeah.
Because this seems like
Yeah.
a
It's real.
giant Sisyphean endeavor. I mean,
Yeah.
you just give
Sisyphean. I
up.
love it. Yes, it is.
Yeah, you just gotta
That's
give up
exactly
after
what
a
it
while.
is. Sisyphus
Yeah,
rolling that ball up the hill and then rolling it up again.
completely. And then you
Yeah.
just keep doing it day in and
Doing it
day out.
over
How
and
long
over
can
and over.
anybody do that? And then there was a young woman, I can never forget her. She said this with a quiver in her voice and a tear in her eye. And she looked at us and said, I'm exhausted by the time I finish work in my company,
Mhm.
with meetings, with coordination, all kinds of things. And she said, when I go home, she said, all I've got left are scraps of myself for my family.
Yeah. I'm sure many of our audience members will identify with that phrase.
And that was like a big punch to the gut. I mean, how can we live in a world where work is designed so that all we've got left are scraps of ourselves for our family? I
Yeah,
mean, that is profoundly wrong.
yeah,
And that's how we got into this whole friction project, because we wanted to understand what's the role of obstacles. So much of the attention is given to incentive,
yeah.
but
Mhm.
not enough to obstacles. And what we kind of discovered was obstacles kind of are like bacteria in our gut. You got good and bad bacteria. You know way
Mhm.
more about this than I do. And similarly, you have bad friction and good friction. Bad
Mhm.
friction arises from obstacles that overwhelm, infuriate, and simply exhaust people.
As David Brooks
That
says, death like death by 1,000 paper cuts.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so that is like the world of bad friction. By the same token, part of what we also need to do is we need to put in some obstacles that slow down and educate people. And the reason is when we take out we call this good friction, by the way. When you take out bad friction, people find it easier to choose a more curious and generous version of themselves. Because when you're exhausted, how can you be curious? How can you be helpful? You just don't have the energy, the stamina. By the same token, leaders also need to prevent employees and others from becoming overconfident and myopic, because we have an overconfident version of ourselves, as you well know, and a
Mhm.
myopic version that lands us in the territory of bias and stereotypes and all that. And so the
Mhm.
question is, how do we prevent people from embracing the overconfident and myopic version of themselves? So you need obstacles that not only slow down, but more importantly, educate, foster reflection, foster deliberation.
Mhm.
And so, and that's kind of the
Yeah.
project.
And if in this modern world with the pace of things accelerating, I
Right.
mean, it's even more important, as you say, to have that good friction in place in strategic positions. And we'll talk more about the good friction a little later, but is that an accurate way of framing that?
Absolutely. That's a
Yeah,
wonderfully pithy way of capturing
yeah,
what we were trying to
yeah.
establish in the book.
Well, we all sort of intuitively understand what friction means, but do you have any specifics around that definition relative to your work? What is friction? How do you define that?
Friction, the friction in the end is resistance of any kind.
Hmm.
And we often think of friction as conflict. But, while that may be a psychologically accessible manifestation of friction, the thing about friction is everywhere in our lives. When we
Yeah.
use roller skates to tires to, just about a lot of the things that power modern life. And in organizations, what we find is friction can either take the way of can be manifested in obstacles such as rules, procedures, and hierarchies and structures and all of those kinds of things. Uh, in which is, as I mentioned, what we refer to as sort of bad friction. Because the real test is what is it doing to an individual? If the outcome is exhaustion and no activation of curiosity and generosity, we're in the terrain of bad friction. When obstacles slow down and educate, we're in the terrain of good friction.
Hmm.
So sometimes the obstacles don't even need to educate. Merely slowing down can be helpful. You started with a lovely airline example of Delta.
Hmm.
And one of the examples is there's an airline in India called Indigo, and it's a low cost airline. So it's very interesting how they think of friction. They both take out bad friction and they put in good friction. So if we pursue that analogy, how do they take out bad friction? The first thing is there are no served meals.
Hmm.
So the only thing you need to give people is hot water and beverages. Beverages are easy to distribute. You give people hot water, and then you give them pre-made packs into which they drop this hot water. and ergo you have a hot meal like a hot porridge or a savory porridge or whatever it is. And so what that kind of does is it makes the job of the flight attendant so much easier.
Yeah.
It reduces weight on the aircraft. You don't need to have complicated heating trays and the like, and so on and so forth. But interestingly, because the airline is a low-cost airline, earlier they were using jetways. And so you'd get off a jetway, get to baggage claim very quickly, and then you'd wait for 7, 8 minutes to get your bags. And for most people, that was like an eternity. And so on
Especially
the
after a
customer
long flight. Yeah.
Yeah, and the customer service side, people would say, what a screwed up airline, and why are they kind of taking so long? So what do? You can improve, of course, baggage delivery and dispatch with costs. But what this airline did is they said, you know what, we're going to stop using jetway. A, we're going to cut cost. And B, we're actually going to get people to deplane, not by using a ladder, but by, using, a path of descent using like a aluminum kind of framework where you just kind of walk in a circuitous, sinuous kind of way.
Hmm.
So you're slowly getting off the aircraft, going to your right, and then turning left, and then right, and then you disembark. And then what you do is they have buses to take you to the boarding. But the amazing thing is, by the time you've done all of that, the bags have arrived.
The bags are there. Yeah.
And now the response of the passengers is, "What a great airline! I just
Yeah.
got off the
Bag
bus,
is right
the
there.
bags were
Yeah.
there." Nothing changed. We
Nothing
just slowed
changed.
you.
Slowed them down. Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
and
great. Hilarious.
sometimes
Yeah.
we have to do that as well.
Yeah.
Uh, so another example of slowing down is there's a Dutch supermarket chain that we allude to in our book called
Yeah.
Jumbo.
Yeah.
And one of the things they have is for elderly customers, they have what's called a slow checkout lane. And the idea is that the people staffing the slow checkout lane and the elderly, because isolation is a big problem, they chat and they talk. And so, it's not as quick as the other checkout line, but people love it.
Yeah.
Or at least the elderly love it and the employees love it too. And now it's spread amongst all of the several hundred stores of the chain. So another example of adding, if you will, good friction, so to speak.
Yeah. That actually hits near and dear to my heart because um, in the book 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals, uh, he refers to convenience culture.
Mm,
And so there's a example. Now I can go on my phone and order any meal I want and it's delivered here within, 30 minutes. That's a perfect example of no friction, pretty much zero friction. But what do I lose in the process? I lose the act of making my own food. I lose the
correct.
process of going to the store and
Exactly.
interacting with people that I know and the joy of picking out the
Exactly.
vegetables and all that stuff. And my going to the grocery store is actually one of the highlights of my day, believe it or not, because I know the people there. I've known them for years. I consider them friends and I enjoy the interactions immensely and I wouldn't give it up for the world. Now,
There you
that's
go.
why, in a way, when I order takeout, which we do, I'm not saying I'm against it, but there's a certain vacuousness to that level of convenience and lack of friction. And anyway, I just wanted to,
No, that's absolutely right. I think, I love where you're going with your example. The thing is, you can certainly have convenience, but you don't need to shortcut conversation.
yeah, human
You
interactions
don't,
and those things.
yeah,
Yes. Yeah.
just because you got it conveniently, it means you have more time to talk,
Yeah.
more time to do things, and
Hmm.
most importantly, to laugh.
Yeah.
Like, how often do we laugh a day? You probably are way more aware of me than as to how many times a young infant laughs, at the age of 3 or 4 months or whatever it
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
Some reports suggest it's several hundred times a day.
But we
But
lose that as time goes on. Yeah.
when we become adults, like the first thing you realize is the biggest cat drop off is in the laughter rate. And
Mhm.
like, I don't know about you, but like, you don't laugh, you're like missing out on oxygen.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
and you see what I mean. So I think part of what we need to kind of do is we need to kind of also do the balancing act in our personal lives
Yeah,
of
yeah.
taking out bad friction and certainly putting in a good friction. For our readers, they might be interested in this. And this was during the pandemic, and my wife, who's also a professor of gerontology,
Mhm.
her principal kind of complaint, if I can so label it that way, was she said the food we're eating is boring. And I said, there's nothing wrong with the food. It's perfectly healthy. It certainly has low variety. That I certainly grant. And she said, what do we do? And I said, maybe randomization would help. And she said, how do you propose to randomize? I said, well, it's not exactly a statistical act I was thinking of. I said, I'm going to do it the old-fashioned way. So I said, I've spread out an atlas we have. And then I told her, I said, close your eyes, take your right index finger, stick it on any place in this map of, and she stuck it. And it so happened she stuck it on West Sumatra in Indonesia. And she said, I said, that's where we're going to make a meal from today. And she
Cool.
said, are you crazy? We don't know anything about West Sumatra. I said, that's the whole point.
That's the whole point. Yeah.
Yeah, and I said, don't worry, it won't be that unfamiliar. If you see the maritime location, it's on, traffic pathways
Yeah,
from
yeah,
India, the Middle
yeah,
East, and all. It's not a big deal. We can easily figure things out. And we made it. It turned out great.
yeah.
But the fascinating consequence of this, and completely unplanned, Michael, was I spent 2 weeks in a rabbit hole learning about maritime Indonesian empires in the second and ninth century.
It
I
opened
had
up a
no
whole
idea
new
why I
world.
did that.
Yeah, yeah,
And I just had a romp.
yeah.
And it was like, I mean, it was completely unplanned spillover. And I think when you, for example, do a simple thing like cooking food using that kind of heuristic, it kind of reminds me of randomization strategies used by native, Indian tribes in the US, where, where are you going to hunt? You can't hunt in the same direction every day. You'll sort of exhaust the supply of like animals and all that.
Mhm.
And they had an interesting randomization procedure where I think they took a couple of bones and sort of flipped them, and you kind of hunted, I guess, in the way the bones pointed to. And to me, it was like a randomization procedure.
Yeah,
It was
yeah.
exploration
And
as
it opened up
opposed to
that curiosity and engagement that you talked about earlier. Yeah,
exactamental.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Exactamental.
Well, on a humanistic level, when you have bad uh, friction, a lot of bad friction in an organization, what are the consequences to our mental health?
So the first thing is we just stop being curious. You got to gut through work,
Mhm.
gut through a day. And how in the world are you going to be generous to anybody? Because you're exhausted yourself. And so what that does is, there's no glue and grease in organization. Generosity is the glue, curiosity is the grease. And if you
Mm.
don't have glue and grease, I don't know how you can make things kind of work, as you can imagine. So to us, that's the biggest consequence of like bad friction. And uh, there are many examples, and you would know more than me. There's like a JAMA article, the Journal of the American Medical Association, which shows, how residents spend very little time, interacting with patients, because most of
Right.
the time they're completing
Yeah.
data and doing other
Front of the
backward-facing things.
computer. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's like what, 1/5 of their time or less is allocated to patients directly. The rest is record keeping, updating. And can we actually liberate them from all of this work? Is that a good use of somebody
Yeah.
who it costs the nation a lot to train? Doesn't seem
Yeah.
like a
No.
sensible kind of idea. Uh, a lovely example of like taking out bad friction was by Melinda Ashton, at Hawaii Pacific.
Yes.
She was like
Yes.
upset,
The
as you may
gross.
recall.
Gross.
Yeah,
Wasn't it the
yeah,
gross? Yeah.
yeah. So she said, "Hey, let's get rid of stupid stuff." And, they got
Which is what
187
GROW stands for. Get rid of
Right.
stupid stuff.
Oh,
Gross. Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And they got 187 targets to get rid of. But what might be bad friction for you might actually be good for me. So we need to understand the spillovers, and they did, and they curated the 187 suggestions to 89 or so. And the lovely example they provide is even a simple act such as reducing the number of keystrokes for nurses, when you telescope it, given the number of patients, the number of rounds, the number of
Yes.
nurses,
Yeah.
they found that it saved them 1,900 nursing hours a month.
Staggering.
Now,
Yeah.
it's like something so simple as that. Now, that's like one example. But the mistake people make with subtraction or the reduction of bad friction is they think it's one and done. Like you do something once and then you're done. But the problem is we really need to mow the lawn.
Yes. I know that's one of your leadership take.
Yeah,
Or is that in the leadership takeaways? I mean, it's a
the
beautiful
friction
example.
fixers takeaway,
The friction
yes.
fixers takeaway. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, you got to mow the lawn.
It's a
And
continuous process of upkeep. Continuous.
completely. And because if you don't mow the lawn, the weeds are going to outstrip the new
Entropy
plants and
always
saplings.
rules. Entropy always
Completely,
rules. Yeah. Yeah.
completely. And so, you know, and the story we talk about as a lovely example of that is again in the healthcare domain. AstraZeneca, it was more like a social movement to simplify and subtract. They saved 2 million hours. And the interesting thing is, 2 million hours equals 1,148 full-time employees. Their goal was not to save the salaries of 1148 employees. They wanted to save 2 million hours because they wanted to give 2 million hours back to the company and the employees. And why is that? So that you can serve 4 million more customers, run 400 early phase trials, and so on.
Yes. Yeah. The
And
spin-off
so,
effects of it all. Yeah.
right. But the most important thing is when you take bad friction out and give employees the gift of time, what is the psychological response to a gift? Reciprocity.
Yes.
The experimental data show that if I give you a gift for $1, Michael, chances are you will reciprocate anywhere between $3 to $7.
Mhm.
So why don't we give employees the gift of time? And the reason we need to give employees the gift of time is, and this is what we talk about in the book, the biggest barrier to accountability is time poverty.
Mhm.
People just don't have enough time. And when people don't have enough time, they cut corners and they do bad things. I can give you experiment after experiment that shows that. And it's not just time poverty. The incentive system in companies and hospitals and pharmaceutical companies and the like is all geared towards rewarding people who add things.
Mhm.
So, like we have the overconfidence bias, now we're coming to terms with the addition bias, if you will.
Mhm. Mhm.
Constantly adding. In one study that we talk about, which was published in Nature, they reviewed 20 experiments and they just said it didn't matter what the task was. Build a Lego model, uh, you know, plan a vacation, reform a university. And in the case of reforming a university, 89% of the suggestions had to do with addition.
Addition of things or structures or
Things,
bureaucracy or whatever.
goals, targets,
Yeah.
you know, and it's too
The bloat.
much,
The bloat. Yeah.
and so it's just a lot. And so that's kind of why we need to mow the lawn. I was teaching the other day 60 chief operations officers. And then, they had operations of large companies. I asked them, how many of you actually mow the lawn regularly? There was one person who raised her hand. And she came up with a creative idea that I would urge our listeners to exploit and use. She said, we try and mow the lawn, Professor. I said, how? And she said, well, I belong to the executive leadership team. We meet every Friday. And one of the things in the meeting is the 1 hour meeting is, she said, we focus on something called a ridiculist. You know, the old TV program, The Ridiculist. But here it is actually a list of the ridiculous things happening in the company. And you can imagine if the top brass is paying attention to the ridiculist and lopping things off, lower down, hopefully it would have a cascading
Have a
effect.
cascade
So
effect.
for all of our viewers, if they're asking themselves, how am I going to mow the lawn? Well, here's a simple start.
Start keeping a
Ask
list.
yourself, what should be on your ridiculous?
Yeah.
When you're giving a performance appraisal to a subordinate, have you actually talked to the person as to what needs to be on his or her ridiculous? Unless that's done, it's going to be very hard
It's under the
to mow
radar.
the lawn.
It's under the
But
radar.
here's a very
Yeah.
simple idea.
Yeah. This is important, this time poverty and going through the book. First of all, I want to just harken back to the title. How smart leaders make the right
Exactly.
things easier and the hard things harder.
Right.
So,
The wrong
but
things harder.
you use the word leaders, the wrong things harder. And I think that's great. And you talk about leaders, these leaders, they're not necessarily up in the higher positions. You're talking about anybody
No,
can lead within an organization, but
exactly.
we are leaders in any form, are trustees of other people's time.
That's right.
And I think that's really a framework that is very important to adopt when you're thinking about anything. So just any comments around that? You've already talked about the time poverty, and I think you've
Yeah,
alluded to that, but I wanted to get out the trustees of other people's time
so
concept.
very thoughtful and helpful of you, Michael, because that is exactly what leaders ought to be. The time of your colleagues and subordinates, it's precious.
Yeah.
Don't piss it away. Don't
Yeah.
waste it. And if you keep wasting it, then they're not going to do much for you. So instead of wasting their time, allocate it in like the most meaningful. So people ask me every time we talk about leaders being a trustee, and I say, they ask me when they come to a Stanford executive education program, how can I be a trustee when I go back? I said, it's very simple. You're sitting in this program. I'm sure you're having good ideas to implement in your company. Do you? And they nod. And I said, as soon as you have an idea, you've already tagged a person to assign this idea to. I said, who are you going to assign the ideas to? You have a list of usual suspects. And all that you're going to do is you're going to heap more on them.
Yeah.
Now, is that a sensible thing to do, to spread them thinly like peanut butter on a slice of toast? Or do you want their time allocation to be concentrated to be of consequence? So start there.
Yeah.
Think of the gift you're going to give your extra milers, your high performers, who are also the most helpful, because they get interrupted a lot during their work by other people
Constant.
wanting their
Yeah.
help.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
So,
that's right.
so we
And
can operationalize this in a pretty simple way. But the other thing in all of this friction is people need to be super clear of, like, what do you want me to do? And it turns out people are often very confused. In part because the language in which values are kind of enunciated, it's sort of abstract and often kind of very distant. Superior patient service. What does that mean? Isn't it better to say put a smile on a patient's face? I mean, I can figure out how to do things. And the example I sort of want to give is of this extraordinary healthcare company called Devoted Health. And it's run by Todd Park, who used to be the chief technology officer in the Obama administration, along with his brother and another guy called DJ Patil, who was the chief data officer. What they do is they are focusing on patients 65 years and older with the idea to improve their mental and physical functioning in the short term so that they have as much long-term health as possible. That means you have to spend more money in the short term to save money in the long term. And so Todd was in our class at Stanford, and we asked him, what's like the most important thing you have done in your company? And this is a company that has 70 to 100 employees. And if you read Andreessen Horowitz Upbeat, the venture capital company's Upbeat
Yep.
assessment, this could be one of the largest companies in the world. And Todd said something very profound. He said, Huggy, at Devoted Health, we have one prime directive to all 70 to 100 employees. This is an example of good friction, by the way. All 70 to 100 of them, irrespective of whatever their job is or whatever, we tell them, when you're making a decision about a patient, pause and ask yourself, what would you do differently if this patient was your mother or father?
Yeah.
What do you think of a prime directive like that?
Fantastic.
People
It
know
grounds
what
it
to do.
in personal, and they know what to do then. You don't need to explain things. You don't need to have a protocol for that.
That means you don't need to educate them. But what you need to do is you need to scale their belief in this. But
Mhm.
in fact, we're going to do this. And that's kind of what they do. They have a story bank. A story bank of what frontline people making decisions, sometimes spending more money in the short term to help a patient, knowing full well it'll have good long-term consequences. And so the whole system is wired not towards denial, but to care.
Yeah, gosh. And I can imagine the insights that would come from those stories about how to
Exactly.
run and do things better as you move along. My goodness,
Not
what a
only that,
tremendous idea. Yeah.
yeah, but they also have a very interesting thing. The senior management meetings at Devoted Health always begin with a story about a patient.
Yeah. Yeah. Stories are the glue of humanity. That's my phrase, and I think it's absolutely
I
true.
love that. They
Yeah.
are the glue of humanity, but they
Yeah.
create common knowledge, they create
Yes, they
interest.
do. Absolutely. It's part of why they're the
And
glue.
there are actually very interesting fMRI studies that show people exposed to the same story, the same portions of their brain light up. So you
Hmm.
actually have a shared brain
Yeah,
functioning,
no, you do. Yeah, I've
you know.
I've actually read and looked into the neuroscience of that. It's fascinating.
There you
Fascinating.
go. That's what I mean.
Yeah, there's a tremendous book. I can't remember the name of it. I think it's the Neuroscience of Storytelling or something by a very well-known writer. He dug into it and did it. It's a tremendous book if you really want to understand the impact of storytelling. Well, now, so you talk about the cone of friction,
Yeah.
and I'd like you to just elaborate on that a little bit. But then also, if you can kind of run through, which I thought were so brilliant, you got separate chapters on these 5 intervention points that one can use as a leader. And again, leader meaning anybody in the organization that gives a damn about reducing friction. These are intervention points that you can move to reduce friction. And I thought the 5 were just sensational. So is that reasonable? Can you kind of run through those or in some way or another, or do you want to touch on 1 or 2, or you tell me?
Sure. I'll touch on a couple. Uh, we talk about friction ramps. I think that's kind of what you mean when you talk of the 5 ways in which friction actually gets and bad friction particularly gets amplified in organization.
Yeah, I'm talking about the oblivious leaders, addition,
Yeah,
broken
that's what I
connection,
mean.
jargon,
So that's exactly
monoxide,
what
which I love, of course. Yeah.
yeah. So the first is oblivious leaders. And leaders are oblivious because one stream of research shows that the more powerful we are and we feel, we have tunnel vision. And added to that, leaders actually don't know how work gets done 3 levels beneath them. So they misestimate coordination difficulty. They think it's like easy to do. And often one study shows they underestimate it by 50%. The other thing is leaders are insulated from inconvenience. So they really don't have much experience of friction. Like, so many people are taking care of you. Like,
Yeah.
how would you know whether
Mhm.
something is like failing? The famous story about General Motors is that every time there was something wrong with the senior executive's car, they would repair it. So you never had to
Yeah.
go to
Never had to deal
the
with it.
garage.
Yeah.
Yeah. And like, so how would you know what the life of an ordinary customer is? So there, you really need to kind of expose top managers to the front line as often as we can. So they understand what is going on, they understand the real nature of it. That's sort of one simple thing. The other big thing that we found in our 5 ramps of friction is broken connection. Missed signals, silos, and the like. And this is like a hard thing to fix. And this is a lovely example of how stories can actually reduce broken connections
Mhm.
because we're on the same page very quickly with the story, at least.
Yes, it connects.
And
Yeah.
yeah, so there are lots of things we can do with broken connection. Stories are one. Rotating people across, is another thing. But the basic sort of idea is what you want contact. And Gordon Allport, the famous social psychologist in 1945, said, if you have contact, prejudice diminishes.
Mhm.
If there's no contact, prejudice increases. And so the operative line is always contact, contact, contact. The third thing we sort of talk about as a ramp to bad friction is jargon monoxide. The proliferation of jargon, abstract terms that people don't really understand, that people have very different interpretations.
You've got some
So,
tremendous examples in the book of jargon monoxide, and everybody will be able to identify with them, believe me.
yeah, and
Extraordinary documents and stuff that have been created, and it's
that's
just like,
right,
oh my God, yeah.
yeah, and like if we can make things like, I tell people, hey, can you come up with something that a 10-year-old can understand?
Yes.
And I want to give our viewers a rich kind of example of how something simple can be powerful. So this was years ago when I was working with British Petroleum. And they had a retail performance unit, gas station and a convenience store. And they felt that they weren't being responsive with their competitor.
Mhm.
And, the senior leadership felt they needed something to both kind of like mobilize people to get them to focus on their competitor. And so they came up with a storyline which was called Slam the Clam. So the clam, of course, is shell in the US. And in the UK, because the way they speak is a tad different, the wording was let's wallop the scalp. When I first heard this, I was like skeptical. I said, those are nice taglines, but like, what do they do? And I was kind of surprised when I went into a meeting room at BP and they were allocating R&D dollars to projects. And each decision they would say, how's this going to help us slam the clam? And they took me to another room where they're making hiring decisions. Each hiring decision, how will this hire help us slam the clam? You can immediately realize how there was a common focus that was very, very quickly created. And you can imagine a 10-year-old kid understanding what this is.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so the more we're able to sort of do things like that, the easier it is. And the plea that we make is you can certainly emphasize the one sacred thing to do, like slam the clam
Slam the
in
clam.
GP's
Yeah. Yeah.
case, but you can also tell people what something you never should do. What is taboo.
Yeah. It can be the other side
And
of the coin, right?
right.
What
And
not to do.
so
Yeah.
that's right. And so if people are clear of that, that's what the prime directive is all about, isn't it?
Mhm.
Free
Mhm.
people up from the tyranny of waiting. You don't need
Yeah.
to wait for your boss to tell you what to do. I know what to do to slam the
Yeah.
clam.
Yeah. Because that's been established. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Mhm.
Exactly.
And
So
then,
those are some of the ramps that we sort of talk about. There are other ramps that I'm happy to chat about, but for us, these are the 3 principal kind of like ramps:
yeah.
obliviousness, broken connections, and jargon monoxide.
Well, there's one other one I'd like to just touch on, and that's fast and frenzied. And
Yes.
this brings me to Jeff Bezos and Amazon and what
Right.
you talk about in the book. And he's famous, or I don't know if he's famous for this, but he says that with certain decisions, they are irrevocable, that you walk through a door, and if you walk through that door, everything is going to change, and it's not, you can't go back. But that's not true of a lot of the little decisions. So you want to just talk about fast and
Absolutely.
furious versus
So,
good friction. This is a good
yeah.
example of good and
So,
bad friction.
yeah, another way of thinking about your observation is, when should you introduce good friction?
Right.
Criterion number one, as you pointed out, is what's the call? How irreversible is the decision?
Mhm.
If a decision is irreversible or very difficult and expensive to reverse, like making an acquisition, expanding into another country, diversifying, or whatever it is, you better add good friction to the
Yeah.
decision
You
making.
better stop, think, and do deliberation. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if the cost of a mistake is pretty low, you don't need to worry. The other thing is, when the work you're doing is complex. So when the work is complex, there are lots of things that you can easily miss. And that's kind of where what you need to do is, you've got to kind of make sure you put in good friction to slow people down,
Hmm.
so they
Hmm.
see interdependencies that may not be obvious, that they may be latent in the system. And they particularly think of spillover effects. So that's like another thing about
Yeah.
complex work. And the third condition is, when you're doing creative work, you need to do it slowly.
Yes.
Doing it
Yes.
fast is not going to get you to
It's
be
not going to
creative.
work for creative work.
Right,
No.
and we have a lovely story in the book about, of course, about Jerry Seinfeld. He was
Hmm.
interviewed by the editor of the Harvard Business Review, one of the editors, and he describes the process he goes through to put his bit together, the comedic bit, and it's kind of arduous and a lot of trial and error. And the HBR editor says, maybe you should get McKinsey to take a look at this. And of course, Seinfeld says, who is McKinsey? Are they funny? And this guy says, no, they're not. He says, the right way is the hard way.
Yeah, the right way is the hard way. Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
For
so I think,
creativity. Yeah.
yeah, so to give you an example, the other day, I won't name the company, we actually had an executive who was simultaneously the chief technology officer and the chief people officer, which is unusual of a large cosmetics company in Brazil. And he was describing their AI adventures, artificial intelligence. One of the things they came up with was, can we use AI to design a new fragrance? And of course, they cut down the time for development, by 35 days or 40 days. And they were certainly elated. There was one problem. The problem was, while they cut down time, nobody liked the perfume.
That is a problem for
You
for a
see the
cosmetics
difficulty.
company. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you kind of realize that some things, there's like, you need, like the human nose in this case, you need human intervention and
Hmm.
involvement.
Hmm.
So the fast and frenzied simply is that speed kills. In
Yeah.
fact, recently I asked one of our students, scrape all the ideas in scrape all the startups in the Bay Area on the web, use a large language model to look at all of their public documents and claims they've made, and quantify their emphasis on speed. She did.
Oh, this
And I
is
said,
interesting.
yeah, and I said, now that you've got a number that tells you the linguistic emphasis on speed in their documents, what's the relationship between the time taken to receive a unicorn valuation or a $1 billion valuation? Predictably, she found the more you emphasize speed, the faster you would actually be perceived as a unicorn and receive this $1 billion valuation. And I said, but do one more analysis. Show us the relationship between the time taken to receive a unicorn valuation and the probability of lawsuits 2 years down the line. And what did she find? The faster you became recognized as a unicorn, the greater the probability of being barraged by lawsuits. And why is that? Time poverty licenses people to cut corners.
Yes. Yes. And
And there you
therefore
have it.
unethical things happen. And, you
Exactly.
know, I mean, this is, you really cover this beautifully in the book. I mean, I wish I could do justice to the incredible pearls and insights that come up in your book in an hour-long podcast, but this is one of the areas that is so enlightening in your book about the time poverty and the slow but continuous pressure it puts on people to perform and cut corners. And, you know, it's a slow downward spiral of sort of
Exactly.
ethical violations that are very tiny but start to mount up over time. Yeah,
Completely.
yeah,
Completely, And I think in the end, kind of what we want to do is we do not want to make work into a frustration factory. That is like, of course, goal number one, to return to the origins of our conversation.
yes,
And the other thing is we should design work in a way people don't feel that just scraps of themselves are left over from.
yeah, no kidding. And the unfortunate thing is I think that that's a ubiquitous issue these days in all corners of our world
So,
here. Yeah.
absolutely.
Well, Huggy, this has been fabulous. And there's so much in this book. We could have an hour-long conversation about each chapter, literally in the book, and it would be that valuable. So again, I so appreciate your time and your wisdom and the fact that you wrote this book to bring enlightenment to so many people.
You
Congratulations
know,
and thank you. Yeah.
Thank you from my heart as well, Michael. It's wonderful that podcasts like this kind of are a wonderful way to get the word out a little bit. But most of all, what we want to do is we want to initiate a conversation where we can make the world of work better.
Yes, yes. And Huggy, you've mentioned many times the various, I don't know, classes or seminars at Sanford. Is there anything if a leader or somebody wants to look into about learning more about this or becoming adept at, learning the skills of being a
Friction
fiction
fixer.
fixer, what would
Yeah,
you recommend?
we thank you. We actually have an online course now as part of Stanford Business School's LEAD series of courses. It's called Leading Change as Friction Fixing.
Wonderful.
And so that's what the course is. And the idea is a lot of transformation, sadly, is about addition and overwhelms people. And that's the reason they fail.
Yeah,
So, you get the idea.
I
So
do.
that course would actually be very relevant.
Great. All right, Huggy, thank you. And please thanks Bob Sutton for
I
me
will
and the
gladly.
Society of Thoracic Surgeons and our listeners for creating this incredible body of knowledge.
Thank you so very, very much, Michael. My gratitude to you and your colleagues. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. This has been The Resilient Surgeon, a podcast brought to you by the Society of Thoracic Surgeons. Thank you so much for listening. If you like this podcast, please rate it 5 stars and let your friends, trainees, and colleagues know about it. On social media, you can use the hashtag #BeYourBestSelf. More information about the Society of Thoracic Surgeons is available online at sts.org.